Welcome to the ECS podcast. I'm Rocky Calvo, Executive Director of the Electrochemical Society. The purpose of this program is to connect the dots between the sciences, our everyday lives, and the sustainability of the planet. Today we'll be talking to Bruce Weisman. Dr. Weisman is a chemistry and materials science professor at Rice University. He's internationally recognized for his contributions to the spectroscopy and photophysics of carbon nanostructures. He is a pioneer in the field of spectroscopy and led the discovery and interpretation of near-infrared fluorescence for semiconducting carbon nanotubes. He is also founder and president of Applied Nanofluorescence. Welcome to the show, Dr. Weisman.
Thank you, Rocky. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'd like to start today, maybe in a little different place than we normally start, by asking you to tell us and explain to us what nanocarbons are. Sort of the freshman 101 version of nanocarbons and fullerenes.
Sure. Well, as you know, carbon is one of the very important elements in the periodic table, and our bodies have a lot of carbon in them. So the field of chemistry has been concerned for much more than 100 years with all the different compounds that can be made with carbon atoms combining with things like hydrogen and oxygen and nitrogen. These are all the organic compounds that compose the substance of our biochemical makeup inside our bodies. But the nanocarbons are a little bit different. These are structures on the molecular scale which consist only of carbon atoms bonded together. So there's no hydrogen, there's no oxygen, there's no nitrogen, nothing else there. And these carbon atoms get together to make nanoscale particles. Nanometer is a billionth of a meter or a millionth of a millimeter. So this is quite a small length scale, but it's large enough to have quite a number of atoms in it. And on this scale, we find that carbon can form these really intriguing structures that can look like soccer balls, or can look like long tubes, or can look like just long hexagonal sheets like chicken wire on the atomic scale. These materials don't seem to exist in nature, really, and we call them artificial nanomaterials. In them, the carbon atoms are all bonded together by strong carbon-carbon chemical bonds, and the result is that these things have a lot of structural integrity and a lot of interesting physical properties. They're classified as either fullerenes, which is the name we give to these closed cage-like molecules shaped sort of like a soccer ball, or nanotubes, which are very extended versions of these structures that are just little cylindrical tubes made out of carbon atoms, or graphene, which is a two-dimensional sheet of carbon atoms, all with hexagonal bonding. And each of these forms of nanocarbon has its own characteristic electronic and chemical and physical properties that are really quite remarkable and unique. The result is that they're of interest to scientists for their basic properties, new opportunities to explore the way nature works, and also they're of interest to applied folks like engineers who want to exploit these properties and make useful gadgets out of them.
Good. That was great. And we're going to get to later in the show all the interesting things these tiny little particles can do. And now what I'd like to do is talk to you about how you got to the point where you were working on these interesting little things. So can you take us back to your early years and talk about the people who influenced you very early in life, childhood, early teens, as we're heading towards before the college days?
Sure. I didn't really have come from a scientific environment at home. My parents were not engaged in science, and it wasn't an atmosphere that was rich in scientific materials or anything. But I always had a real intrinsic interest in the field, I think. So even going back to elementary school, I can remember being fascinated by different kinds of science and wanting to tinker around with things. I read books about astronomy and chemistry, and in the basement of our home, I set up a little chemistry lab where I tinkered around. And certainly in elementary school, science was always the subject that fascinated me the most. So I think it really goes way back, and I consider it just kind of an intrinsic interest of mine. As I went through school, I focused on science, so I was a chemistry major in college, and got into a little bit of research there, and kind of stayed on the research path that has taken me into an academic career.
Well, let's talk about your bachelor days at chemistry, earning the Bachelor's of Arts in chemistry at Johns Hopkins University, and whether and who might have had some influences on you during those years.
Sure. As I say, I was a chemistry major there, and I remember doing okay in sophomore organic chemistry, but not really. It didn't really get me very excited. And then the next year, we were exposed to physical chemistry, and that was a revelation for me. When I got into those physical chemistry classes, I knew that this was the part of chemistry that I really wanted to be engaged in. So I considered that that's the beginning of my identity as a physical chemist. And shortly after that, or maybe near the end of that year, I joined the research lab of Aaron Block, who was a very young assistant professor at Hopkins, had just come a year or two before. And he was looking for undergrads to help him out in his research lab. And I was in that first batch that he recruited. So that was very exciting. I got to be around a physical chemist as he set up his laboratory and started out doing some novel experiments. And that really, I really caught the research bug there. So I worked a lot as an undergraduate in his lab. And he was a very influential person in my early scientific development.
And from Hopkins, you went on to get your PhD at the University of Chicago.
Right. Actually, that was probably mostly due to Aaron Block's influence, because that's where he had gone to graduate school. And I wound up following him to the University of Chicago then, and even wound up working for the same professor that he did his PhD with. So it was it was kind of following in his footsteps there.
And who was that?
That was Stuart Rice. Stuart Rice is a very eminent physical chemist who is a distinguished theoretician, and he also directs a lot of experimental work. So I was in a research lab there that had a pretty much even balance of people doing theoretical research and experimental research. It's very unusual in physical chemistry for somebody to be able to span those two subdisciplines. I was an experimentalist, and I've always, I've never thought that I had the aptitude or inclination to be a theoretician. So I was doing experiments in Stuart Rice's group, but there were a lot of my group buddies were theoreticians, and by interacting with them and seeing group seminars and just the atmosphere there, I gained a lot of appreciation for the theoretical side of the subject, and I think that benefited a great deal from that.
Anything interesting to tell us about some of your group buddies, as you describe them, colleagues that you still have?
Keep in touch with some of them. There were some real characters, but and people who have gone on to very, very eminent careers and great fame. I probably shouldn't disclose anything too embarrassing about these folks, but there were some interesting times there for sure.
I guess, and really what I was poking at was whether any of them are doing work in nanocarbons.
Probably not. I think not. That was a long time ago, of course, long
right.
before nanocarbons came around, and to my knowledge, none of those folks are doing that sort of thing.
Yeah, no, that's what I would have guessed. So, let's move on to your academic career, which started very soon after University of Chicago. 1979 is what we have in our records. Is that correct?
Yeah, of course. After I graduated from the University of Chicago, I did a postdoc for about 2.5 years at the University of Pennsylvania, and I worked with Robin Hochstrasser there. My thesis work involved some efforts to do picosecond spectroscopy, which was quite a new technique at the time. It involved taking short laser pulses and using them to monitor very fast processes going on in molecules, especially things like energy transfer or very fast chemical reactions. So at the time I was a graduate student, we didn't really have any equipment for doing that, and a lot of my thesis time was spent constructing very specialized pulsed laser apparatus in order to pursue these experiments. So I got a lot of experience in that kind of technology, more than I wanted probably. And then when I moved on to a postdoc with Robin Hochstrasser, I was doing more of that picosecond spectroscopy. But his lab was already much better set up for that kind of work, so I had the opportunity to do more experiments and less construction there, and that was a lot of fun. That was the work that eventually led to my getting hired in an academic position at Rice, which I began in 1979.
And so I'm always trying to make connections back to your what pieces got you working towards this nanocarbons field. And so, if I understand you correctly, these were some of the building blocks that were occurring as a postdoc that led to eventually your work in nanocarbons. Is that fair to say?
Right. I was working in an area called time-resolved spectroscopy, which is a way to study photophysical processes, that is, processes by which excited molecules dispose of the energy that they get by absorbing light. And I was at the time studying these processes in medium-sized molecules. So I was a spectroscopist and photophysicist studying these medium-sized molecules, actually in the gas phase when I came to Rice. So I would look at them bumping into each other and exchanging energy. Sometimes the excited molecule would figure out a way to dispose of its energy internally, and I would try to monitor that, understand that. Sometimes they would fall apart and undergo what we call photochemistry or photodissociation, trying to understand the details of these processes. So this was a pretty active field at the time. I was engaged in it along with many other people in physical chemistry. But really, I think the way that evolved into my study of nanocarbons traces from the discovery in 1985 of the first nanocarbon, Buckminster Fullerene, which happened right here at Rice University, and that was my colleague Rick Smalley's work.
Right. Now, you got there in '79, as you said, and which is before Smalley made this discovery, and so was his work and influence on your involvement in this area?
It absolutely was. For the most basic reason that until these materials were known, nobody could work on them, and he was the one who really launched, he made the first discovery and launched the whole field in that way. Apart from that, of course, he generated all this excitement about the discovery of C60, and my lab was right adjacent to Rick's, so that in 1985, when he made the discovery of the C60, I was like right in the next room, and I remember one day he was walking through my lab, and he had this page in his hand with one of the very first mass spectra that shows the evidence of the C60 in his apparatus, and he said, "Bruce, look at this. I think this could really be an interesting result."
Yeah, to say the least.
And that's one of the great understatements, I think.
Yeah. So what happens at a university with a discovery like that? It must almost change the environment. The excitement it generates, the interest in not just yourself but other people, wanting to find out more about this field, this interesting Buckminster Fullerene.
Right. It was, it was electrifying because everybody understood pretty early on what a big deal this was, how important it was, and it also reflects, I think, the kind of collaborative atmosphere that we had in the department then. It was an interesting discovery. Rick Smalley had not been working on carbon at all. He had been working on metal clusters, and he had a very powerful, unique experimental apparatus where he could make little clusters of metal atoms in the gas phase and turn them into a molecular beam and use fancy optical and mass spectrometric methods to monitor their characteristics and their reactions. So this was a very powerful apparatus, but he wasn't working on carbon. His colleague and mine, Bob Curl, was a spectroscopist who had a friend in England, Harry Kroto, who was very much interested in figuring out the source of some unusual spectral signatures in interstellar space. That is, there were certain spectral features that you could see in astronomy that were coming from space, and nobody really knew what chemical materials they came from. So Kroto was trying to solve this mystery and figure out the source of these lines. So he was a spectroscopist trying to assign those lines to some species that we could see on Earth if we prepared them properly. And he imagined that they might be from carbon clusters. So he asked Bob if it would be possible, Bob Curl, it would be possible to come over and do a collaborative experiment on the Smalley apparatus, where instead of putting metals into their cluster apparatus, they would put carbon, and then they would make, in other words, they'd put a piece of graphite in instead of a piece of metal, and rather than generate little clusters of metal atoms, they'd generate clusters of carbon atoms. And then Kroto was hoping that some of these small clusters with maybe 8 or 10 carbon atoms in a row would have a spectrum that matched what he was seeing from outer space, and he could identify what the source of that signal was. So that was the idea of that collaboration. And Kroto came over, and he and Curl and Smalley collaborated on these experiments with the carbon clusters. The students in the lab at the time doing the work were Jim Heath and Sean O'Brien, two very good graduate students of Smalley's. And as they did these experiments, they noticed not only these kind of small clusters coming out of the apparatus with a few carbon atoms, but as they looked at higher and higher masses, they saw evidence of carbon clusters that had a lot of carbon atoms in them. And in fact, as they changed the experimental conditions in very clever ways, ways that a lot of investigators might have totally overlooked, they realized they could adjust. As they did that, they saw changes in the abundances of these different clusters at high masses. And in fact, eventually, they were able to see very dominant features at masses corresponding to 720 mass units and 840 mass units. And these were clusters with 60 and 70 carbon atoms. And there was something special about these. The 58 carbon atom peak was very low, but the 60 carbon atom peak was very high. And that's the spectrum that Smalley walked through my lab with that day and showed me and thought had to be really significant. And that really was, because they had adjusted the conditions so that these carbon atoms had spontaneously formed these cage structures with 60 and 70 carbon atoms. The 60 carbon atom structure is what we now know as Buckminster Fullerene, or C60, and it has this beautiful soccer ball structure.
Right.
So from the mass spectrum, all they could tell was what the mass of this material was, but they didn't know what the structure was. And but the excitement was enormous. It was really just that group, of course. It was just Smalley, Curl, Kroto, and their students who were electrified by this observation, and they went away and in just a day or two, in this frenzy of creative science, they figured out that the only sensible structure for 60 carbon atoms was going to be the soccer ball structure. And that was a great creative leap based on very, very thin evidence and a lot of intuition and cleverness.
Yeah.
So that's what they published almost immediately. It made a great splash and created so much excitement in the chemistry community for years. But an interesting thing was that the structure could not be proven until C60 was actually isolated, because at this point, C60 was just a very sparse species in a molecular beam. You couldn't put it in a bottle. You couldn't look at it. All you could do was get a few instrumental signatures, like its mass. Basically, you just knew about its mass. And that wasn't enough to prove a structure or to really learn enough about it. So there was a lot of effort at that point to try to make macroscopic quantities of it, so you could put this in a bottle and use all the powerful techniques of chemistry to figure out really what it was and to run reactions on it and do interesting things. But that turned out to be very hard. Smalley was one of the folks who worked quite diligently to try to isolate this material, and those efforts went on for a small number of years. But it really wasn't until, I think it was 1990, when a pair of investigators called Kretschmer and Huffman finally managed to generate C60 and isolate it from as a solid powder. And this was a really big deal, because in those 5 years, the structure of this nanocarbon, the first nanocarbon, remained speculative. It was suggested by the Rice group, and a lot of people believed that, but there was no proof. And there were other folks in the community who were actually challenging that quite vigorously and were quite skeptical of that structure. So finally, 5 years later, somebody figured out how to make fullerenes as bulk materials instead of just little signals in a mass spectrometer, and that just made the field explode. Within no time after that material was available in bulk, it was subjected to NMR spectroscopy, and it was immediately obvious that the soccer ball structure was correct. And the Smalley, Curl, Kroto structure was immediately vindicated, and there was no more controversy about that structure. And at that point also, the field of fullerene chemistry just took off, because now you had something in a bottle that you could really work with.
Right.
And that's really the point at which the fullerenes investigators found a home in the Electrochemical Society and started coming to discuss their work.
Right. You've got a great story there, and to think this happened very early in your career, and you were across the hall, and Richard Smalley says, "Hey, you want to take a look at this?" And for you, a great opportunity to be there and work with somebody and see all this happen right.
Right, it's like watching history happen right in front of you.
Right
there. But interestingly, the kind of work I did didn't lend itself to fullerene studies until it was isolated. So even though I was watching all this, as a colleague, I wasn't a collaborator in the fullerenes work, and it wasn't until the early 90s when you could really get your hands on bulk samples of the fullerenes that I directed my own research to study some of their properties. So at that point, I stopped working so much on these gas phase energy transfer processes, and I started to look at the fullerenes, which don't really exist as a gas, so you put them in solution instead. And then we were studying properties of their excited states, their spectroscopy and their decay processes, and some of their chemical reactions as well. And that occupied me for a while, studying the fullerenes, and that was exciting because instead of studying compounds that had been worked on quite a bit by other investigators over the years, now I had the chance to work on compounds that were really quite new to the chemistry, and that means that you could ask some very simple research questions, kind of first-round questions instead of 10th-round questions, and find out their basic properties, and I found that to be a lot of fun. But then it was around about 2001 that Smalley really had the greatest impact on my career, because at that point he had switched his own focus from the fullerenes to carbon nanotubes, which are a related material, in which the carbon atoms are stretched into these very long cylindrical tubes. And Rick was a real pioneer in that field as well. He didn't discover the nanotubes, but he made enormous contributions, including developing several of the most effective methods for producing them. And he was involved in producing them and characterizing them and trying to find applications that they would be useful for also. At that point, his research was so broad-based that he was looking to bring in collaborators to specialize in certain aspects of the nanotube studies. So he asked if I and my group would come and collaborate on the spectroscopy and photophysics of the nanotubes, whereas before we had just been working on the fullerenes. And this seemed like a good idea to me. So at that point, I really began an active collaboration with Smalley, and that turned out to be transformative for my career, because within a year or so, we had discovered that the semiconducting carbon nanotubes fluoresce. They emit light in the near-infrared part of the spectrum after you excite them. And this was a big deal discovery, and we were also able to assign that complicated spectrum, so we knew which nanotubes were responsible for which spectral features. And those discoveries, as I say, created they really constituted a breakthrough in the nanotube world. And everything I do now, 15 years later, is really a direct outgrowth of that discovery. So we're still working with nanotubes and still finding ways to use that fluorescence for useful purposes.
Well, let's connect the dots then a little bit. That discovery you're referring to is 2002, right?
Yep.
Okay.
That's right.
And so this would be a good time to talk about the kind of influence and application that you could foresee with carbon nanotubes. Can you talk about that a little bit?
The applications that I could foresee, is that
yes.
That kind of a theme? Well, I guess the things that I foresee were not particularly different than what other folks in the field could see right away. And they mainly grew out of the fact that these materials had such unusual physical and chemical and electronic properties. The nanotubes come as either semiconductors or metals, and of course these are the basic building blocks of electronics. So from the standpoint of electronic device community, these are very interesting building blocks from which you can imagine making all sorts of new types of circuitry and devices. And then from the standpoint of materials folks who want strong materials, nanotubes have enormous strength, because if you're trying to pull a nanotube apart by stretching it, you have to break a number of carbon-carbon bonds, and that takes a lot of energy. The result is that the nanotubes are much, much stronger than steel, for example, per unit weight, and therefore, if you're looking for a building material that has that characteristic of great strength without being very heavy, the nanotubes can be very attractive as a novel material. They also have properties that are appealing for sensor applications, because you have all these atoms that are exposed to the environment. So if there's a perturbation in the environment, like some kind of gas phase molecule that, say there's a toxic gas that you want to detect, well, if it has an appropriate interaction with the nanotube surface, then you can detect that through the change in the nanotube's electronic conduction, or maybe its optical properties, so that they lend themselves to a number of sensor applications. So there are a lot of technological fields, many of them quite distinct from each other, like composites and coatings and microelectronics.
Well, can you speak to biomedical?
And biomedical as well. There are ideas for biomedical. So there are many different applications communities that got interested in nanotubes. And if you look in the published literature now, you'll find way over 100,000 papers that have been published about carbon nanotubes.
Yeah.
It's really overwhelming.
So in addition to your work at Rice, you're also the founder and president of Applied Nanofluorescence. Tell us a little bit about your company.
Oh, well, the company is really a spin-off of some of the research that we've done at Rice. It's a consequence of our discovery that I mentioned of the fluorescence and the interpretation of that fluorescence from the single-walled carbon nanotubes. So after we made that discovery around 2002, I recognized that this represented a powerful new characterization method for the nanotube community, that a lot of nanotube researchers would want to use fluorescence to figure out what's in their samples. So at the time, after we published this, I had several colleagues who would send me samples from other institutions and say, "Can you tell me what's in the sample? Do your fluorescence spectroscopy on it." And that was nice, but I wanted other people to be able to do it on their own instead of having to come through me. As part of that effort, I realized that we needed to make it easier to do than the kind of analysis that we were doing here. So we actually developed some specialized hardware instrumentation that would very efficiently capture the fluorescent spectra of these materials, and associated software which would let those spectral data be analyzed kind of automatically or semi-automatically, so that the person doing the analysis didn't have to be a full-time nanotube spectroscopist in order to figure out what the data meant. And the idea was to make this technique more accessible to the non-specialist in the nanotube field and to promote its use in other laboratories. After I failed to get interest in commercializing this device by some standard instrument companies, I decided that it wasn't that hard to maybe make this available myself. So I decided, with the help of my very talented colleague, Sergei Bachilo, to start a little company on the side where we would design, manufacture, and sell these instruments to other nanotube researchers so that they could use fluorescence spectroscopy to characterize their samples. It's a very small company. We started out with funding just from my wife and me, so we're the only owners, and we've never had more than one full-time employee. But working in our spare time and with the help of our employee, Sergei Bachilo, and I have been able to make these instruments, and we have actually several generations of them. We started in 2004, and at this point there are more than 30 of these things in use in nanotube laboratories around the world. So this has been rather satisfying to see the methods that we developed get use in a rather wide range of laboratories.
Yeah.
Our customers have ranged surprisingly widely. We have academic labs, as you might expect, as customers, but some of these people are doing things like environmental studies or things that are not really physical studies of nanotubes. In addition, we have a number of companies that have bought them to characterize their nanotube samples. and a number of government labs, including the National Cancer Institute and the Environmental Protection Agency and the Food and Drug Administration. And we have some of these in laboratories around the world as well. So I think it's been a benefit to the nanotube community, and it's been satisfying for us.
You started to talk about where this connected to the Electrochemical Society, and I actually was working here at the time, I think around 1990, when some of the electrochemists in leadership position sort of recognized, well, there must be, you alluded to the fact that, there wasn't just excitement at Rice University, but the chemistry community has said, trying to take a look at what this is and where it could go, and there's excitement overall, and which, of course, included our organization. And a couple of people, actually from Bell Laboratories, had made a special trip here to our offices in Pennington to discuss with our staff the potential and what we should be doing, and really just led to finding some of the folks who were working in this area, had some leadership position, and basically started a symposium which led to the carbon nanostructure division that we have today. So what was your role? What did you start getting involved? Were you there from the beginning? Certainly from a scientific level, you were one of the founding fathers. And so as far as the organization and involvement in ECS, when did that begin?
Well, I wasn't there quite from the beginning, I have to say, but within a couple of years after the isolation, I was part of that research community. My first ECS meeting, I think, was the spring 1994 meeting in San Francisco. That's the one I remember. Mm-hmm. And but the Fullerenes group inside the ECS had already been established at that point, and the symposium had been going on for at least a year, maybe 2 years before that.
Yeah, it was the first symposium was 1992, and I might as well say it because it's part of this discussion. We're going to congratulate you on your 25th anniversary this year.
Yes, that's exciting. So I guess a couple years after that group was formed, I remember getting an invitation. We had just published our first paper in this field, I think, and then someone contacted me and said, would you like to come to this Fullerene Symposium at the Electrochemical Society? And I thought, that's great. Somebody noticed what we did, and they're interested. Mm-hmm. So I came, and I got hooked right away. So I've been coming every year since 1994. And over that time, I've, of course, gotten more involved in the organization and got to be a symposium organizer and then an officer. And now I'm finishing up a stint as chair of the division.
There's so many different applications or potential or of this molecule. It could have landed anywhere, and rightfully so. I mean, there's such diversity involved, and I assume. I mean, my understanding of it. I've been working with this group for a long time. Is that they found a home here and got the right people like yourself involved, and now have had 25 years of really outstanding technical presentations and a group that comes to our meeting every spring. What are your, as you look back on it, some of the things that have made it work, made it successful?
Right. I agree with you entirely, Rocky. It really has been a very successful symposium series, and it's remarkable also how long it's remained that way, because a lot of things come and go. For example, during this period in the 1990s, there was a huge wave of interest in fullerenes, and there were symposia not just at the Electrochemical Society, but at the American Chemical Society, the Materials Research Society, and those were some very good symposia for sure. But they never persisted the way they did at the ECS. So this is something that has really taken root at the ECS in a way that it hasn't in the other societies. And I think everybody really feels very, very attached to the Electrochemical Society for providing this long-term home for this type of work. The factors that led to that, I think, have to do with the receptiveness of the ECS to house this topical group that really was quite distinct from the other ones that are around. I mean, we don't have, especially at that point, we had no overlap with the battery community
Right.
or fuel cells or any of the other traditional strengths of the Electrochemical Society's technical areas. So there's kind of an open-mindedness that it could encompass other new topics that had potential interest. And of course, as time has gone on, there's been evolution. So we started out as something called the Fullerenes group, because fullerenes were the only nanocarbons known at that time. And then a few years later, I guess a few years later, the carbon nanotubes started to become an important research topic. And we broadened out to include research in carbon nanotubes area as well. I think we changed our name then to fullerenes, carbon nanotubes, and fullerenes, nanotubes, and carbon nanostructures. So we had that very long, cumbersome name for quite a while.
Right.
And as the group grew, we eventually reached the point where we qualified to be a full division inside the ECS instead of just a topical interest group. So we became that division. And then another nanocarbon attracted a lot of attention in the last 10 or 12 years. I guess that's the graphene. Graphene became isolated, and many experimental projects began with graphene. So we also grew to encompass graphene research. And at that point, it seemed like instead of adding still another word to the name of the division, it would be good to consolidate it a little bit. So we managed to change our name to NanoCarbons division, which now includes both fullerenes and nanotubes and the graphene and some other related materials too. But the group has evolved as the field has evolved, and symposia have come and gone. Some topics basically got played out as interesting questions emerged but then were answered, and the activity in that area died down. And other topics grew in interest. So the symposia have adjusted in their numbers and their topics to reflect the current research activities in the field.
And a couple of landmarks from my perspective. One is the name change that you mentioned. I was laughing when you said that, because that long name, I never did know what it was. We used to use an acronym, FCNCIA, whatever that stood for. I know,
that was even worse, wasn't it?
But you also, earlier in the conversation, were talking about what a beautiful image is presented by the Buckminster Fullerene. And I think to this day, I think we had it on the cover of Interface when Smalley won the Nobel Prize, and I think it's still our best cover. It's a beautiful image.
It just is aesthetically pleasing. This perfectly symmetrical molecule that's shaped like a soccer ball. It grabs everybody's imagination, and it just even laymen just like to look at it. Also, it's just a very beautiful molecule. And
besides its beauty, it's for an organization like ECS to have such direct involvement and such a strong technical presence, and then the leader of this community, the discoverer, gets a Nobel Prize, that's as big of a headline as we'll ever get. And
you bet.
It was just a terrific time. And to take that even a little bit further, and I know you had a lot to do with this, which is why I want to mention it. We, in 2006, created the Richard Smalley Award, which is one of our finest awards. To be able to have it named after Richard Smalley and have such a close connection to the community is really a very special thing in ECS.
Right. Yes, unfortunately, Rick Smalley died in 2005 of cancer at far too young an age.
Right.
And that was a great loss to Rice University and to the scientific community, and really to the world scientific community. So anyway, because he had this unique role in discovering C60, launching the study of carbon nanostructures, and also as a pioneer in carbon nanotubes, which is such an important area within there, I really thought that it would be an appropriate thing to recognize, and memorialize him through this Smalley Award that our division now gives. And as far as I know, it's the only award named after Smalley in any scientific society. So I think we retain that distinction.
Yep.
And we've been careful to, we've been fortunate to have many very distinguished scientists nominated for this award, and we've been able to bestow it on them even though it's not a lot of money. It's not like the Nobel Prize, but I think that they've all been very grateful, and they appreciate the significance of having the Electrochemical Society NanoCarbons division recognize them with that Smalley Award.
Oh, awards like this, it helps the stature of ECS, because you're right. It's the money's never a bad thing, of course, but it's not the most important thing, and to have the award named in his honor and to recognize important people in this field is really it's a great thing for ECS, so we really appreciate having that. What about the future, the potential of this symposia? It's your story suggests that there's so many directions it can go. It almost makes me feel uncomfortable that, I wonder if we can continue the momentum and continue to have such a strong symposium. Will it fragment? What will happen? Any thoughts about that?
Well, it's hard to foresee the future, of course, but so far we're on a pretty good upward trajectory, I think. I believe that this coming spring we're going to have 350 papers in the symposia that we sponsor. So that's really a large number for us.
Yes.
And it's gotten so large, in fact, that it creates some organizational problems trying to prepare a schedule where you squeeze in all those talks and don't have the have the program run forever, and don't have too many parallel sessions competing with each other.
That's right.
So we're actually reaching saturation point, I think, where we can have all those talks. But one reason why these symposia have been successful, I should say, is not just that there's a home for them in the ECS, but that they've always been run in a rather democratic fashion. There are some scientific meetings where the business model, if you will, is to invite a few very distinguished scientists to come and give long talks, and they're like the headliners who are then supposed to attract many other participants. So these few people are enticed with significant fees and payment of their expenses, and basically you buy a couple headliners, and then lots of other people come. And there isn't so much time for the other people to present their own work, so many of them wind up giving posters and have kind of less visibility. Mm-hmm. But the ECS meetings, especially in our division, have always been a much more democratic model, where we don't do that. People almost always just pay their own way to these meetings, and it's always amazed me that we get such wonderful participants, even though we can't offer them anything except a 20-minute speaking slot. So instead of having a few people speaking for a long time and most of the other ones speaking for 5 minutes or giving a poster, we have everybody with the same slot with very few exceptions, and it's almost like a workshop atmosphere where a lot of peer-to-peer interactions mm-hmm. and time for discussion. And I think that one reason why we have such good participation is because a lot of the folks really appreciate that. I remember once there was a nanotube person that we invited to a symposium a few years ago, and at the end of the meeting he said, "I've learned more like in one day here than I did in a whole 4-day meeting someplace else. I love this format." And it really is appreciated. It's efficient and it's workshop-like, and that way we get a kind of a loyal following. So that's been a characteristic of our symposia too.
Yeah. No.
As for the future, I think that the topics are going to evolve just as the research activity evolves. So probably we are always thinking about whether the activity in one area is falling off and its symposium needs to be merged with another one, or maybe discontinued. Maybe a new symposium needs to be brought online, or maybe a symposium has gotten so large that it needs to split into two, and we've done that sort of thing also. And I think that as these fields mature, some of the focus is going to be shifting from the basic research into applications,
right?
Because that's the direction that things go into. When you learn more and more about a topic, you're able to use that information to engineer real-world applications. And then instead of just talking about basic science, we'll have people increasingly talk about real-world applications of that basic science. So that's probably a direction that I can foresee in the future.
Yeah, and I appreciate your comments about the meetings themselves and the environment that I think ECS tries to create. I think it's in our DNA, and I think that some of the founding fathers of this particular now division within ECS were really very good at being very inclusive. I just remember early on them scrambling for funding and trying to get so many different people involved. It's always been part of the culture of this symposium, and it's good to hear that it's continued and had the effect that it's had. You know, it's a good problem to have, but I sympathize with the challenge of managing 350 papers and trying to share that information in really essentially 4.5 days is not such an easy thing to do.
Right. Another characteristic is we've always had very strong international participation. So there's no doubt that we really are recognized around the world as the place where people working on some chemical aspects of nanocarbons should come to discuss their work and present it to peers. We also are quite open to students. It's a good place for students to get some early conference experience. And it's one of the few important conferences, I think, where a student who has any decent results to present and submits an abstract can get a speaking slot that's just as long as some famous scientist. So we try as much as we can to accommodate the younger scientists just coming up through the system, as well as the distinguished ones, and not banish the students to the poster session.
Absolutely, and again, it's worth mentioning that the leadership in the division of this symposium have worked very hard to be inclusive and to find funding and support of some kind to get people there, and that's just been part of the success and the community they've built. I wanted to just to change gears just a little bit. It's sort of the same subject, but just to get your comments. You are on the ECS Board of Directors, and this idea of sort of a democratic system to, exchange information is something that's really relevant to our publishing efforts as well. And as you know, we've embarked on a campaign to provide a platinum open access of our digital library. And would you mind sharing your thoughts about what we're trying to accomplish with our publications?
Right. I think that's a very noble goal. The situation really in science is that it costs a lot of money not only to do research, but also to publish that research, to distribute it to the people who need to see it. And one issue is who's going to bear the cost of that dissemination of the knowledge. And there are different models that have been employed over the years. There are commercial publishers who make it, who basically make it free to the investigators, so the investigators don't have to provide funding from their own research budgets in order to publish, by and large. But then the commercial publishers will charge university libraries, for example, great sums of money to subscribe to these journals. So in order to read it doesn't cost money to publish the papers, but it costs a lot of money to read the papers. And that's a big barrier. There are society journals which use a kind of a mixed model where they may charge just a little bit for publication or maybe nothing at all. And they charge somewhat less for the subscriptions, but they have to meet their expenses too. So the question is, how do they meet their expenses? And the ECS is now trying to make this free to the scientists who publish and also to the readers. And that's, I think, what you mean by the platinum open access. And then the question is, well, who's really paying for this? And the answer is ECS is trying to do it by generating a large endowment and paying from the society's own funds. So if the endowment gets large enough, they will be able to finance the entire production of the journal and its distribution to anybody who wants to read it, and just pay the whole freight. And that's the ideal situation in terms of the greatest accessibility of the scientific results to the community and to the public at large.
Right. Do you think it's fair to say that this will increase or advance the pace of innovation if we're successful?
Well, of course, the ECS is not, is only one part of a very much larger scientific community.
I meant in our field.
In your field. Yeah. It seems like it has a pretty good shot at doing that. Yep. The more access people have to research results, the more rapidly they appreciate the findings and can incorporate that information into their own research plans. So you would think that would just make the whole research enterprise cycle faster, because in a sense, all research that is done is building on prior research. and that requires current researchers to understand what is going on around them and what has gone on previously. And the more accessible that information is about prior results and very recent results, the more they can quickly adjust their own research activities to the current knowledge, and it should accelerate progress in the field in some way or another.
Yeah. Well, we hope so, and I think it's an important initiative, and certainly your technical area is an important part of that. My producer is telling me we're getting close to the end, and so I actually would like to give you an opportunity to make some closing remarks, or any thoughts, or maybe something we didn't cover that was important in this particular conversation.
I guess just in terms of general remarks, the importance of the scientific enterprise to society as a whole. Society has been very generous in supporting research, which is an expensive undertaking. And sometimes the benefits are obvious because of inventions that arrive, and new technologies. So when people like their new iPhone, they can appreciate the scientific underpinnings of all that technology. But only a very small fraction of scientific research eventually winds up as an application, and it has a lot of value, I think, as just part of mankind's effort to understand the world around. Mm-hmm. And so those research efforts, I think, really need to be supported and continued, and societies like the ECS play a very important role in letting that happen, I think.
Well said. And thank you for sharing your story, a fascinating story about an incredible scientific discipline area. We really appreciate your time today on this podcast.
You're very welcome. It's been my pleasure.
Thank you, Dr. Weisman. Bruce Weisman is an ECS Fellow, and as the current division chair of the ECS NanoCarbons division, will be celebrating 25 years of NanoCarbons Symposia at the 229th ECS meeting in San Diego this May. You can find Applied Nanofluorescence on www.appliednano.com. Find ECS on Twitter at ECS.org. Listen to more episodes of our podcast by searching ECS Podcast on iTunes, or just go to our website, electrochem.org. Thank you for joining us today.